It is February in the Siberian taiga, and the cold here is not the kind of cold that most people ever experience. A cold that bites through every layer you have and reminds you very clearly that you are not in charge out here. The temperature has dropped to somewhere around -40 degrees, and the forest, which stretches in every direction for what feels like forever, is completely, utterly silent. The birch trees stand like pale ghosts in the dim winter light, their bark, white and papery and almost luminous against the snow, catches whatever weak sunlight manages to filter through the canopy. There, growing out of the trunk like some kind of wound, like a fist of burned charcoal punching through the pale bark, is something that looks less like a living organism and more like the aftermath of a fire. It is black. Deeply, completely black on the outside, rough and cracked and ancient-looking, and it just sits there, growing imperceptibly slowly, year after year, in one of the harshest environments on the surface of the planet. The people of this region, the Khanti, the indigenous communities who have called this brutal and beautiful landscape home for thousands of years, have a name for it. They call it a gift, a medicine, something so valuable that knowledge of its uses was passed down as carefully as any other survival skill, because in a place where the nearest doctor might be hundreds of miles away and winter lasts most of the year, knowing which things in the forest can help you stay alive is not a hobby, it is everything. This is Chaga, and its story is stranger, older, and more complicated than almost anyone realizes. Most people in the United States first heard about Chaga sometime in the last 10 or 15 years. Maybe a friend mentioned it. Maybe someone on the internet was making a very confident claim about it curing something serious, and you weren't sure whether to believe them or scroll past. That uncertainty, that feeling of not quite knowing what to make of something, is actually a pretty reasonable response to Chaga. Because the truth about this fungus sits in a genuinely interesting space between ancient wisdom, modern science, and a whole lot of questions that haven't been fully answered yet. Chaga is not a mushroom in the way most people think of mushrooms. It doesn't have a cap. It doesn't have gills. You won't find it on the forest floor or growing out of a rotten log. What you find instead is this massive, irregular, lopsided growth erupting from the trunk of a living birch tree, most of the time, though it occasionally appears on other trees like alder or elm. The exterior is that striking, burnt black color, deeply fissured and cracked, and it can grow to be absolutely enormous. Some specimens reach the size of a basketball, some are bigger, and the largest recorded examples have been growing in the same spot on the same tree for more than 20 years. Inside, though, Chaga tells a completely different story. Crack one open, and instead of black, you find a rich, warm, golden-orange interior, dense and almost woody. It has a faint, earthy, slightly vanilla-like smell that takes most people by surprise. Nothing about the outside prepares you for the inside. But there's something strange here. The part you see on the outside of the birch tree, the black mass, isn't actually producing spores or reproducing in the way most fungi do. It's more like an extreme expression of the fungal body itself, a kind of fortress that the fungus builds as it grows deeper and deeper into the wood of the tree. And it is, make no mistake about it, a parasite. Chaga slowly kills its host. The fungus works its way into the heartwood, breaking down the tree from the inside, and it can take decades. But in the meantime, something extraordinary happens. As the fungus grows through the birch, it absorbs and concentrates compounds from the tree itself, running them through its own biology, transforming them and accumulating them in that dense black exterior mass. This is the part that changes everything. Because birch trees are not ordinary trees, and what Chaga pulls from them is not ordinary either. To understand why anyone in the ancient world would have thought to eat something as deeply unappealing looking as Chaga, you have to understand the context in which they lived. The boreal forest, the great northern belt of spruce, fir, and birch that stretches across Siberia, Scandinavia, Canada, and Alaska, is one of the most extreme and isolated ecosystems on Earth. The winters are brutal and long. Food is scarce for months at a time, and illness, something as simple as an infection or a prolonged fever, could be a death sentence when there is no access to any form of medical care. In this world, paying attention to the forest was not optional. The Khanty people of western Siberia, for instance, had an extraordinarily sophisticated knowledge of the plants, fungi, and animals around them, built up across countless generations of careful observation. They noticed that when animals in the forest were sick, some of them would seek out specific things to eat. Wounded bears have been observed rubbing against certain trees. Elk have been seen consuming specific plants. The forest, if you watch it carefully enough, is full of information. And chaga was not something you had to watch for long before noticing that it might be special. The communities that lived alongside birch forests began using it at some point so far back that there is no written record of exactly when. It was brewed into a tea, ground into a powder, sometimes simply chewed. The Khanty used it for stomach problems, for skin conditions, for general weakness. Other Siberian communities used it as an anti-inflammatory, as a treatment for infections, as something given to people who had what we might now call cancer. That last part, the cancer connection, is something we absolutely have to come back to, because it's both the most exciting and the most contentious aspect of Chaga's story. The earliest written reference to chaga being used as medicine comes from somewhere you might not expect, 12th century China. Records from that period describe a dark fungal growth found on birch trees being used to promote longevity and vitality, described in language that is poetic and somewhat imprecise by modern standards, but clearly refers to something very much like what we would call chaga today. By the 16th century, references to chaga appear in Russian folk medicine records. Tsar Peter the Great, who ruled Russia in the early 18th century and who was, by all accounts, intensely interested in anything he thought might give him or his military an edge, is said to have drunk chaga tea regularly. Whether this is entirely true or somewhat embellished by later storytelling is hard to say with certainty, but the fact that the story exists at all tells you something about how chaga was regarded by that point. It was considered valuable, prestigious even. There is also a deeply human story from the 20th century that brought chaga into the Western literary consciousness in a way that dry medical records never could. In 1966, the Russian Nobel Prize-winning author Alexander Solzhenitsyn published a novel called Cancer Ward. It drew heavily on his own experience of surviving cancer while imprisoned in a Soviet labor camp in the 1950s, and it contains a vivid and surprisingly extended passage describing the rural peasants of Russia drinking a black tea brewed from a fungus growing on birch trees, apparently remaining remarkably free from the cancers that were afflicting the urban population around them. Whether Solzhenitsyn's novel reflects actual epidemiological data or whether it is a literary device doesn't entirely matter for our purposes. What matters is that it introduced the idea of chaga as a potential anti-cancer agent to a global reading audience at a moment in history when cancer was a deeply feared and poorly understood disease, and it planted a seed. That seed would take decades to germinate into actual scientific research, but when it did, what scientists found was complicated, fascinating, and nowhere near finished. Here's the thing about researching a fungus that grows exclusively in remote boreal forests, that takes decades to reach maturity, that has been used informally for thousands of years,
but virtually ignored by mainstream Western science until recently. You are starting from almost nothing in terms of rigorous, controlled, well-funded studies, and that's not a criticism of the people who used chaga or believed in it. It's just a practical reality of how scientific research gets directed, which tends to follow money, and money tends to follow things that can be patented and sold at scale.
Chaga cannot be easily patented. It grows wild, and until relatively recently, the financial incentive to study it in depth just wasn't there. But researchers, particularly in Russia, Finland, Japan, South Korea, and increasingly the United States, have been slowly building up a picture of what chaga actually contains and what those contents might do. And even setting aside the most dramatic claims for a moment, what they've found is genuinely impressive. Let's start with the most visible thing about chaga, that remarkable black exterior. That black coloration comes from an extraordinarily high concentration of a group of compounds called melanins. It's the pigment that colors our skin and hair and protects us from ultraviolet radiation. But the melanins in chaga are a particular type, produced in extraordinary quantities, and they have some remarkable properties. These melanins appear to have significant antioxidant activity. Without going too deep into the chemistry, antioxidants are compounds that help neutralize unstable molecules in the body called free radicals, which are implicated in everything from cellular aging to the development of certain diseases. Chaga's antioxidant capacity, measured using several different scientific methods, is genuinely extraordinary. On one commonly used scale called the ORAC score, chaga consistently ranks among the highest of any natural substance ever tested, higher by a very significant margin than almost anything you would typically eat.
The second major group of compounds that makes chaga interesting, and this is where things start to get really specific to birch trees and really unusual, is a group of molecules called triterpenes. In particular, betulinic acid and its precursor compound, betulin. Here's where the parasite relationship between chaga and its birch host becomes almost poetic. Birch trees produce betulin in large quantities. It's part of what gives birch bark that characteristic white color and waxy texture. The tree uses it partly as a defense against insects and pathogens, and when chaga grows into a birch tree, it absorbs this betulin and converts it, through its own biological processes, into betulinic acid and related compounds. These compounds concentrate in chaga in quantities that dwarf what you'd find in the bark of the birch tree itself. Why does this matter? Because betulinic acid has been studied pretty extensively in laboratory settings as a potential anti-cancer compound. Research going back several decades has shown that it can selectively trigger a process called apoptosis in cancer cells, and betulinic acid, in laboratory studies, appears to be able to switch that mechanism back on, at least in certain types of cancer cells. This is exciting. We should say clearly that it is exciting. Studies in cell cultures and in animal models have produced some genuinely promising results. Certain types of cancer cells, including some melanoma cells and some lung cancer cells, have been shown to be susceptible to betulinic acid in these controlled laboratory conditions. But here is where we have to be very honest, and this is the part that gets lost in a lot of the popular coverage of chaga. The gap between a compound doing something interesting in a petri dish and that compound becoming a viable treatment for cancer in a human being is enormous. It is one of the most challenging and expensive gaps in all of medicine. The vast majority of compounds that show promise in laboratory settings either fail to translate to animal models, fail to reach the right tissues in the body, fail to be absorbed properly, or produce unacceptable side effects when tested at the doses required.
As of today, betulinic acid has not been approved as a cancer treatment. Clinical trials in humans are limited and ongoing. What we can say with honesty and with genuine enthusiasm is that the underlying chemistry is interesting enough to justify serious, continued research, and that is not nothing. Now let's talk about the immune system, because this is where the conversation about chaga gets both more accessible and more robustly supported. Chaga contains significant quantities of a group of complex sugars called beta-glucans. If you've spent any time in the world of functional mushrooms, you've probably encountered this term before, because beta-glucans are found in many medicinal mushrooms, including reishi and turkey tail. They are one of the most studied classes of compounds in the entire field of mycological medicine. Beta-glucans work primarily by interacting with the immune system in a rather elegant way. Our immune cells have receptors on their surfaces that are specifically designed to recognize beta-glucans, which is interesting in itself, because beta-glucans are a feature of many pathogens, including bacteria and fungi. So the immune system, over millions of years of evolution, has developed the ability to recognize these molecules as a signal that something requiring attention is present, and it responds by ramping up certain aspects of immune activity. What this means in practical terms is that consuming beta-glucans appears to prime the immune system, to increase the production of certain immune cells and chemical messengers that coordinate immune responses. Studies in both animals and humans have shown that beta-glucan consumption can enhance the immune response to infections and may improve the body's ability to respond to certain threats. The research here is considerably more developed than the cancer research, though it still comes with caveats. Chaga's beta-glucan content is real and measurable. Its effects on immune markers in the body have been demonstrated in several studies. Whether this translates into a meaningful reduction in your likelihood of getting sick during flu season is harder to quantify, but the basic mechanism is sound and the evidence is more than just anecdotal. There is also an interesting additional layer here. Chaga contains compounds that appear to have anti-inflammatory properties, working through mechanisms that are somewhat different from its immune-stimulating effects. This anti-inflammatory activity may be part of why traditional communities reached for chaga when dealing with chronic pain conditions, joint inflammation, and other inflammatory disorders. Again, the research is ongoing, but the biochemical pathways are real. Let's step back from the laboratory for a moment and think about something else, something that gets far less attention in the popular coverage of chaga, but which is honestly one of the most remarkable things about it from a purely biological standpoint. We talked at the beginning about the environment where chaga grows, the boreal forest, -40-degree winters, intense UV radiation in summer, extreme dryness punctuated by heavy rain, a physical environment that is genuinely hostile to most forms of life. And yet, chaga not only survives in this environment, it thrives. It grows over decades in conditions that would destroy virtually anything else. And it does this by producing, in extraordinary quantities, exactly the kinds of protective compounds that allow it to withstand those conditions. The complex structural molecules that allow it to maintain integrity against physical damage. In a very real sense, chaga is a biological archive of survival strategies. Millions of years of evolution in one of the harshest environments on the planet, written in chemistry. And when you consume chaga, you are in some sense borrowing those strategies. Your body gets access to compounds that were refined over an almost incomprehensible span of time, specifically for the purpose of surviving extreme environmental stress. There's something philosophically interesting about that, regardless of any specific health claim. The idea that the same chemistry that allows a fungus to survive a Siberian winter might be doing something useful in a human body sitting in a very different climate
is not far-fetched. It's actually quite a reasonable hypothesis. Biology tends to be resourceful like that. There is a chapter of Chaga's history that almost nobody in the United States knows about, and it is one of the most fascinating examples of traditional knowledge being pressed into service by historical necessity that you will ever come across.
During World War II, Finland was in an extraordinarily difficult position. Caught between the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany, subjected to devastating military conflict and cut off from global trade routes, the Finnish population faced serious shortages of many basic goods. Coffee, which by the 20th century had become an absolutely essential part of Finnish daily life and culture, was nearly impossible to obtain. So the Finnish people did what people in desperate circumstances tend to do. They looked around at what they had available and they improvised. And what they had available, in the birch forests that cover much of the country, was chaga. It was ground up, brewed in hot water, and drunk as a coffee substitute. The taste, earthy, slightly bitter, with a hint of something almost chocolatey or vanilla-like, was apparently not a bad approximation of coffee when you were used to having nothing. This is not a minor footnote. Entire communities relied on chaga as a dietary staple during those years, and those communities, the research would lead to suggest, showed some unusual patterns in terms of certain diseases, patterns that researchers began looking at more carefully once the war was over and there was bandwidth to think about such things. The Finnish wartime use of chaga is actually one of the most compelling pieces of historical evidence we have that sustained consumption of this fungus has measurable effects on human health, because it wasn't a controlled study, obviously, but it was an unintentional long-term experiment conducted on a large population, and the results were interesting enough to motivate subsequent research.
You can still find chaga tea being drunk in Finland today, not as a wartime necessity anymore, but as a cultural tradition, something passed down and maintained because people liked it and because it seemed to do good things. The Finns have a long memory. In Russia, chaga's medical use was formally recognized and studied during the Soviet era. A pharmaceutical preparation derived from chaga called befungin was developed and sold in Soviet pharmacies as a treatment for gastrointestinal problems and as a general tonic. Befungin is still available in Russia and some Eastern European countries today. It is one of those rare cases where a traditional folk remedy was taken seriously enough to be incorporated into official medicine, even if the evidence base was never quite as rigorous as modern standards would require. The Soviet interest in chaga is interesting for another reason too. During the Cold War, there was significant Soviet investment in researching natural substances that might provide health and performance benefits, partly because there was genuine scientific interest, and partly because there was ideological motivation to demonstrate that the natural resources of the Soviet Union had unique and powerful properties. Some of what emerged from that research era was genuine, and some was politically motivated exaggeration. Separating the two retrospectively is sometimes difficult, but not impossible, and serious researchers have spent considerable effort doing exactly that.
So let's talk about the elephant in the room, or maybe the black fist-shaped fungus on the birch tree in the room. You can buy chaga in almost any health food store in the United States right now. You can find it as a powder, as capsules, as an extract, as chunks for brewing your own tea, and as an ingredient in ready-to-drink beverages. The market has exploded in the last decade, driven by social media, by the functional mushroom trend more broadly, and by a genuine cultural hunger for alternatives to conventional medicine, or at least supplements to it. And the quality control in this market is, to put it diplomatically, highly variable.
This matters more for chaga than for many other supplements for several reasons. First, chaga's concentration of bioactive compounds varies enormously depending on where it was harvested, what species of tree it was growing on, how mature it was, how it was dried and processed, and how it was extracted. A chaga supplement made from young sclerotic growth on the wrong species of tree, poorly dried and minimally processed, may contain only a fraction of the compounds you're hoping to get from it. Second, there are serious sustainability concerns with wild-harvested chaga that are not getting nearly enough attention. Chaga takes anywhere from 10 to 20 years to reach harvestable maturity. The global market for it is growing very quickly, and there are real fears among mycologists and conservationists that unsustainable harvesting practices are beginning to deplete wild populations in some regions. If you are purchasing chaga, paying attention to where it comes from and whether the source takes sustainability seriously is not just an ethical consideration, it may be a practical one, because a depleted forest means less available chaga for everyone in the future.
Third, there are some people for whom chaga consumption is genuinely not advisable. Chaga is very high in a compound called oxalate. People with kidney disease, kidney stones, or conditions that affect oxalate metabolism should be cautious and really should speak with a doctor before adding chaga to their routine. Chaga also appears to interact with some blood-thinning medications and may affect blood sugar levels in ways that are relevant to people with diabetes. The idea that something natural is automatically safe for everyone is a genuinely dangerous assumption, and chaga is a good illustration of why. Now, none of that is meant to dismiss chaga, quite the opposite. The point of taking it seriously is that it deserves more than either uncritical celebration or reflexive dismissal. Because here is what we can say, based on the evidence available right now. Chaga has one of the highest concentrations of antioxidant compounds ever measured in a natural substance. Those compounds are real, they are measurable, and they appear to be biologically active. The beta-glucans in chaga have a well-documented mechanism of interaction with the immune system, and the broader research literature on beta-glucans from fungi is one of the more solid bodies of evidence in the entire field of nutritional supplements. The betulinic acid and related triterpenes in chaga are genuinely interesting candidates for further medical research, particularly in oncology. And while the leap from laboratory promise to clinical application has not yet been made, the research is ongoing and the biochemical basis is legitimate. The anti-inflammatory compounds in chaga represent another avenue of genuine scientific interest with a plausible mechanism and some supportive evidence, even if the clinical picture is still being assembled.
And then there is the simple experiential reality that millions of people across multiple cultures and multiple centuries have consumed chaga and reported benefits. This is not proof in a scientific sense. It is not controlled, it is not double-blinded, it is subject to placebo effects and selection biases and countless confounding variables, but it is also not nothing. Traditional knowledge, when it has proven robust enough to persist across generations and across the intense selective pressure of harsh environments where doing the wrong thing can kill you, has a track record that deserves at least some respect. The most intellectually honest thing we can say about chaga right now is that the full picture is still being assembled. The outlines are genuinely exciting, the details require more work, and the truth, when it comes into clearer focus, is likely to be more interesting than either the most enthusiastic sales pitch or the most cynical, skeptical dismissal. Let's go back to that boreal forest one more time, because there's a detail about chaga that we haven't talked about yet, one that is easy to overlook, but which, once you know it, changes the way you think about this entire organism.
When a chaga mass is growing on a birch tree, the part you see on the outside, that black exterior mass, is only a portion of what the fungus actually is. The fungal mycelium, those microscopic threads we talked about earlier, penetrates deep into the wood of the birch tree. It spreads through the heartwood, slowly consuming the tree from the inside over the course of many years. The visible exterior mass is, in a sense, the exhaust of this process, a byproduct and a repository. The fungus deposits some of its most concentrated chemical products there, in that dense black exterior, perhaps as a kind of protection against the elements, perhaps for reasons we don't fully understand. The relationship between chaga and its birch host is a strange one to sit with ethically, if you're inclined to think about ecosystems in those terms. The fungus kills the tree, slowly, over decades, but certainly and inevitably. And yet without the birch tree, there is no chaga, and without chaga, the birch forest ecosystem would look quite different, because chaga plays a role in the decomposition and nutrient cycling of birchwood that has ecological consequences beyond the individual tree. It is a relationship that is neither purely parasitic, in the simple sense we usually mean by that word, nor anything approaching mutualistic. It is something more complicated. The tree dies, the fungus lives, the forest continues, and in the process, something is created that appears to have profound biological properties that we are only beginning to fully understand. There is something very human in our fascination with chaga. We are drawn to the idea that the harshest environments produce the most powerful medicine, that something which survives conditions that would destroy everything else must contain secrets worth knowing. Whether that intuition is entirely correct in every specific claim made about chaga or not, it has, at least in this case, led us towards something genuinely worth investigating. The leading edge of chaga research right now is moving in a few exciting directions. There is increasing interest in chaga's potential role in supporting the gut microbiome, that vast community of microorganisms in our digestive systems, whose importance to overall health has become one of the most significant areas of biomedical research in the last 2 decades. The polysaccharides in chaga, including its beta-glucans, may act as prebiotics, feeding beneficial gut bacteria and supporting the kind of diverse microbial community associated with better metabolic health, better immune function, and potentially better mental health. This is a relatively new area of research, and the findings so far are preliminary, but it's a direction that makes biological sense and is attracting serious scientific attention. There is also research being done on chaga's potential antiviral properties. Some laboratory studies have shown that certain chaga extracts can inhibit the replication of specific viruses in cell culture conditions, including some that are relevant to human health. Again, the caveat about the gap between laboratory results and clinical application applies here. But the underlying antiviral mechanisms are interesting and are motivating further investigation. And perhaps most exciting, at least from a very long-term perspective, is the possibility that some of chaga's compounds might have applications in addressing antibiotic resistance. We are living through what public health experts describe as an antimicrobial crisis. The antibiotics that have been the cornerstone of modern medicine for the better part of a century are becoming less effective as bacteria evolve resistance to them. New antimicrobial compounds are desperately needed, and natural products, including fungi, have historically been one of the most productive sources of such compounds. Penicillin, after all, came from a mold. The search for new antimicrobials in the fungal kingdom is very much ongoing, and chaga, with its extraordinary chemical complexity and its long history of use against infections,
is a legitimate candidate for investigation.
If you are someone who is currently drinking chaga tea or taking chaga supplements, here is what the current science suggests. You are consuming a substance with a genuinely impressive antioxidant profile and a real, well-characterized mechanism for supporting immune function. You may be getting meaningful amounts of compounds that are interesting candidates for more powerful medical applications. You are doing something that millions of people across many cultures have done for a very long time and generally reported positively. If you have any pre-existing health conditions, particularly kidney issues or conditions requiring blood thinners, talk to your doctor before continuing. Make sure your chaga is coming from a reputable source that can tell you where and how it was harvested. Think about sustainability and resist the temptation to treat it as a replacement for conventional medicine when conventional medicine is what's actually required. If you are someone who has never encountered chaga before and is wondering whether to try it, the honest answer is that the evidence does not support some of the more dramatic claims made about it, but there is genuine substance behind the interest. Brewing a tea from a carefully sourced, properly prepared chaga is not a bad addition to a thoughtful approach to health. It is not a miracle, and it is not a scam. It is a fascinating biological substance with a long history and a legitimate scientific future.
In the late afternoon of a Siberian February, when the light is already failing and the temperature has dropped another few degrees since this morning, a Khanti elder moves through the birch forest with a certainty that comes from a lifetime of knowing exactly where to look. She has done this hundreds of times. She knows which trees to approach and which to leave alone. She knows how to harvest without taking too much, without depleting what future generations will need. She knows how to dry and prepare what she finds so that nothing valuable is lost. She does not know what a beta-glucan is. She does not know the structural formula of betulinic acid. She has never heard of apoptosis or ORAC scores or randomized controlled trials. But she knows something that took her community thousands of years to learn. Knowledge built up through careful observation and the unforgiving school of survival in one of the world's harshest environments. Modern science is, slowly and with considerable effort, catching up to what she already knows. Not perfectly, not completely, not without important caveats and complications, but the direction of travel is clear. Something real is happening in that black growth on the birch tree. Something real enough to have kept people coming back to it across continents and centuries. Something real enough to justify laboratories around the world investing time and resources in trying to understand it.
We are nowhere near the end of Chaga's story. In some ways, we are barely at the beginning of understanding it properly. But the questions it raises about medicine, about the relationship between traditional knowledge and modern science, about what the most extreme environments on Earth might have to teach us about survival and resilience, those questions are worth sitting with. And while you sit with them, you might as well brew a cup of tea. If you found this journey through the world of chaga as fascinating as we did, there's a simple thing you can do right now that makes a real difference. Hit that like button, and if you want to keep exploring the hidden worlds of fungi, traditional medicine, and the remarkable science of the natural world, subscribe and come along for everything we have coming up next. Drop a comment below telling us whether you've ever tried chaga, what you thought, and what questions you still have. The forest has a lot more secrets to share. We'll see you for the next one.